Marvin Lubenow wrote in a book called Bones of Contention. Astounding book. He had a couple of, maybe a chapter or so on Darwin, a biblical and scientific perspective. Now allow me to quote Darwin, he says. But just in proportion as this process of extermination has acted on an enormous scale, so must the number of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed be truly enormous. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. Missing link, where is it? And this, perhaps, is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory. The explanation lies, as I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geological record. Darwin said that the number of intermediate forms fossilized in the rocks must be enormous, that they have not been found, and that their absence is the most serious objection one could have against his theory, and that they have not been found only because of the imperfection of the fossil record. Darwin felt that the fossil evidence was so important, and the lack of transitions was such a serious threat to his theory, that he devoted an entire chapter in the origin of the species to the imperfection of the geological record. For 100 years, evolutionists paraded the fossils they found as evidence for evolution. In the early 1970s, when it became obvious that we had a more than adequate sampling of the fossil record, the grim reality dawned that those transitional fossils were not to be found. The punctuated equilibrium model of evolution was then invented. We don't know where they are, so let's invent a theory about it. Or it's actually a theory. It's not a theory, it's a model. Because a theory has to be proved scientifically, and it wasn't. So the punctuated equilibria model of evolution was then invented to explain why they were not found. You know, if you're accused of a crime and the evidence is overwhelming toward you, I guess the way to do that is to invent a story. And unfortunately, the whole world has swallowed it. However, it is imperative to emphasize that the punctuated equilibrium model does not remove the need for transitional fossils. You can't have a model to say why they're missing. You still need the fossils. It just explains why those transitions have not been found. Certainly, the punctuated equilibrium theory is unique. It must be the only theory ever put forth in the history of science which claims to be scientific, but then explains why evidence for it cannot be found. Here we have an excerpt from Wikipedia. In evolutionary biology, punctuated equilibrium, also called punctuated equilibria, is a theory. Actually, it's just a model. Theory has to be observed, reported, and falsified. So a theory that proposes that once a species appears in a fossil record, the population will become stable, showing little evolutionary change for most of its geological history. This state of little or no morphological change is called stasis. When significant evolutionary change occurs, the theory proposes that it is generally restricted to rare and geologically rapid events of branching speciation called cladogenesis. See, make a big up name not like this. People go, oh boy, this guy knows what he's talking about. Cladogenesis is the process by which a species splits into two distinct species rather than one species gradually transforming into another. Punctuated equilibrium is commonly contrasted with phyletic gradualism, the idea that evolution generally occurs uniformly by the steady and gradual transformation of whole lineages. In 1972, paleontologists Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould published a landmark paper developing their theory and called it punctuated equilibria. Their paper built upon Ernst Mayer's model of geographic speciation, I.M. Lerner's theories of developmental and genetic homeostasis, and their own empirical research. Eldredge and Gould proposed that the degree of gradualism commonly attributed to Charles Darwin is virtually non-existent in the fossil record, and that stasis dominates the history of most fossil species. You don't know where it comes from, you don't know where it's going. The popular myth is that the hominid fossil evidence virtually proves human evolution. The reality is that this evidence has been a disappointment to evolutionists and is being de-emphasized. Didn't work, so okay, let's play it down. And is that science? In actuality, the human fossil evidence falsifies the concept of human evolution. The Bible, the Word of the living God, clearly declares that humans were clearly created, specially created. The human fossil evidence is completely in accord with what the Scriptures teach. Lubenow, in his work, we return to that, many think of Darwin as a religious man. He studied for the ministry at Cambridge. His wife, Emma Wedgwood, daughter of Hosea Wedgwood, a maker of Wedgwood china, seems to have been an evangelical Christian. Also, Darwin refers in The Origin to creation and to God. There are even reports that toward the end of his life, Darwin experienced the new birth. Unfortunately, all of this gives a false impression. It was parental influence that caused Darwin to study for the ministry. Even in his early years, Darwin's personal commitment to orthodoxy seems to have been minimal. Emma's influence upon Darwin was basically one of restraint. He never shared her faith, but often softened expressions of his opposing views out of respect for her. His references to creation in The Origin were highly critical of that doctrine. His references to God were only those of a theist, not those of an Orthodox Christian. Darwin's spiritual journey was actually a journey in reverse. He moved from an anemic orthodoxy in his early years to a non-orthodox theism in his middle years to agnosticism in his senior years. It is inaccurate to ever describe Darwin as an atheist. However, the influence of evolution upon him was fatal. It would not be difficult to show a relationship between his commitment to evolution and his rejection of biblical Christianity he rejected. Reports of Darwin's alleged conversion have been common in some evangelical circles for many years. Not only was Darwin said to have experienced the new birth, but he was also reported to have repudiated his writings on evolution. I have personally seen tracts making these claims. As much as we might wish that these reports were true, I am sorry to say that they are actually false. Since none of Darwin's biographers report any such experience, and there are no other records of it, about the only way to verify such an event would be through his personal correspondence. 1919, Darwin's son Francis published a biography of his father, together with a collection of his father's correspondence. So, Francis Darwin, The Life and Letters of Charles Darwin. A study of the letters written by Charles Darwin between the time of his alleged conversion and the time of his death clearly reveals that he experienced no such change of mind and heart. Not only is there a total lack in these letters of any reference to a conversion to Christ, there are many positive expressions of his continued faith in evolution. As far as can be determined, Darwin remained an evolutionist and an agnostic to the day of his death. It is a misunderstanding to think there is evidence from Darwin's life that evolution is compatible with biblical Christianity. The second major misunderstanding of Charles Darwin concerns the nature of his accomplishments. While it is commonly thought that his major work was an attempt to put the concept of evolution on a solid scientific foundation, that was only a secondary matter. The scientific evidence for evolution was not that impressive. Darwin's major accomplishment was not in the area of science, but in the area of philosophy. Allow me to quote one of the world's leading biologists, Ernst Mayr of Harvard University. Nothing could be more wrong than the immemorial assertion, Darwin was no philosopher. One must grant Darwin's opponents the validity of two of their objections. First, Darwin produced embarrassingly little concrete evidence to back up some of his most important claims. This includes the change of one species into another in succeeding geological strata, or the production of new structures and taxonomic types by natural selection. More importantly, Darwin left totally unanswered certain serious problems like the origin of life and of new genetic variation. Ernst Mayr, Evolution and God, in his book. Not only was Darwin's contribution primarily in philosophy, it was a philosophy bent on a special mission, to show that creation is unscientific. The most extensive research into Darwin's religious attitudes and motivations has been done by historian Neil C. Gillespie, Georgia State University. He begins his book with this comment: on reading The Origin of Species, I, like many others, became curious about why Darwin spent so much time attacking the idea of divine creation. Neil C. Gillespie, in his book, Charles Darwin and the Problem of Creation. Gillespie goes on to demonstrate that Darwin's purpose was not just to establish the concept of evolution. Darwin was wise enough not to stop there. Darwin went for the jugular vein. Darwin's master accomplishment was to convince the scientific world that it was unscientific to believe in supernatural causation. His purpose was to ungod the universe. Darwin was a positivist. This is the philosophy that the only true knowledge is scientific knowledge. No other type of knowledge is legitimate. Obviously, to accept that premise means to reject any form of divine revelation. Darwin accomplished one of the greatest feats of salesmanship in the history of the world. He convinced scientists that it was unscientific to deal with God or creation in any way. To be scientific, they must study the world as if God did not exist. Of course, your hypothesis there is unscientific because you have to prove the hypothesis before you get to the resulting study or studies. You just can't make an assumption God doesn't exist, therefore let's look at this. Ernst Mayr recognized the true significance of what is called the Darwinian revolution. The Darwinian revolution was not merely the replacement of one scientific theory by another, as had been the scientific revolutions in the physical sciences, but rather the replacement of a worldview in which the supernatural was accepted as a normal and relevant explanatory principle by a new world in which there was no room for supernatural forces. You can't make that decision, you have to prove it. In all of this, it is important to realize that Darwin was not an atheist. He did not exterminate God, he just evicted God from the universe which God had created. All that God was allowed to do was to create the natural laws at the beginning. It's peculiar. God didn't exist in our creation. But he did create the natural laws. Because where did they come from? From then on, nature was on its own. With God out of the picture, evolution fell into place rather easily, since evolution seemed to be the only viable alternative to special creation. Allow me to say it again.